Welcome everyone to another episode of Give Me an Answer. This is kind of a new type thing we're doing in terms of interview discussion. We've got an awesome one today with Sean McDowell, who is a professor at Biola, speaker, as well as author. You probably know his dad, Josh McDowell, as well. They've written Evidence Demands a Verdict. Check out Sean's incredible YouTube channel. I've watched, Sean, your different apologetics panels, as well as your debates, some with college students, and that has all been fantastic stuff. But your YouTube channel as well is really impressive in terms of how hard-hitting it is, how many topics you cover, how many speakers you have on. So that's fantastic, and welcome to the channel.
Well, Stuart and Cliff, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate the invitation.
Right on. So, and then GMAA folks, we have another special guest next week, Eric Metaxas. So we're kind of rolling out different type interviews here. And so just stay tuned to that, but really excited here with Sean. Sean, we want to start off just kind of put you on the hot seat here, if you don't mind, with as many questions as possible. It's going to really help the listeners. So again, if you guys want to hear further, check out Dr. Sean McDowell, his YouTube channel. What kind of more of a personal question here. What has it been like working with your dad? When did that start? When did you kind of get the call to go into apologetics and teaching?
I think the first time I formally worked with my dad was when I graduated from college and I decided to be an intern for him for a year. Growing up, he always had kind of a college or post-college age student travel with him and just carry his bag, set up books, run the PowerPoint. I thought, you know what, here's a cool chance to work with my dad, to learn from him, to travel around. And that was when I started working with him more officially, although it wasn't a little bit later when I started teaching high school that I felt like I could bring something more uniquely to the table and we'd share the stage and start writing together, so to speak.
That's great. That's awesome. All right. So I know one of the topics that we took interest in that you have covered quite a bit is when you are debating skeptics and atheist agnostics. How do you think through the issue that was on your channel that I saw in terms of what do the skeptics wish Christians really knew?
So that's actually a talk that's more designed to help Christians have fruitful spiritual conversations with skeptics. So it's very different than if I'm going into a debate or kind of a substantive conversation on a YouTube channel or on stage. That was really designed to just say, okay, Christians, how do we have genuine conversations? So, step number one, just find out what somebody believes and just listen. I mean, I've spent too much time in my life responding to questions that people weren't asking because of my assumptions. So step one, find out what someone believes. Step two, find out why the person actually believes it. So that's just a talk that's meant to kind of surface, like, tell me what experiences defined your life. Tell me who influenced you the most. Tell me your understanding of and your experience with God and with the faith. So that's just meant for people sitting down over coffee or these days over Zoom, just talking and listening and trying to get past some of the debate and rhetoric today. How I prepare for a debate with an atheist would be a little bit different.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. So do you frequently get kind of the straw man type terminology when it comes to, I guess, Christians and atheists oftentimes strawman each other? I hear that one on a regular basis. And when we debate atheists, oftentimes we'll hear an atheist say, and we do it too, I mean, don't strawman me. Is that kind of also what you're getting at there?
I hear that all the time.
Yeah.
And I try not to do that with other people. I mean, I actually made, believe it or not, a TikTok video this morning, why I think atheism is the most boring worldview by far. And the point was, what makes life interesting is that we have free will. You can choose love over selfishness. You can choose mercy over hatred. You can choose justice over injustice. Life is only interesting because we have choice. If we're all robots, life would be boring. But atheism implies that everything is determined and there is no free will. So that actually makes life completely boring. My point is not that it's false. So I did a quick video, and I don't think a single person even understood my point. And they're like, well, Christianity's boring. Here's why. I'm like, okay, separate point. Others are like, you don't understand free will. I said, well, I kind of quoted Sam Harris. I actually do. So I have to spend a lot of time trying to go, no, that's not what I mean. Actually, I mean this, which reminds me to try to not straw man other positions too.
That's bold. I like that, though. That's a way to go after it, because in our politically correct culture, obviously, people get very sensitive when we go to college campuses to debate. Oftentimes, the debate will actually get interrupted by a person who claims to be tolerant, but oftentimes they are the most intolerant, highly progressive, some staunch feminists who are great people, and yet oftentimes staunch feminist people on the far left who will come in and say, whoa, this is too aggressive. We shouldn't be debating things. And one college student once said to me, we shouldn't even start a discussion until we agree with each other on everything. And so it's really interesting just where the culture is going in that kind of way. I saw the excellent debate, well, more of a conversation that you had on the show Unbelievable. I think his name's John Steingart, right? And he was a worship leader. So he's one of the worship leaders, I guess, who recently said, I don't believe anymore. Some of he said he's been doing a ton of reading, I think hours every morning, into different Christian apologists, as well as different atheists. What were some of the themes of that conversation that were interesting or frustrating for you to listen to and engage with?
Well, I love that conversation. And kind of some of the backstory was John Steingart was the lead singer for the band Hawk Nelson, really popular early 2000s, 2010s. And maybe 6 or 8 weeks ago now, did a 2,200 word post on Instagram why he no longer believes and why he left his faith. And it was really heartfelt. And I thought it was thoughtful as well. So I wrote a post, and I intended it to critique some of the issues, but just be as kind and gentle towards him as I could, thinking maybe this guy will read it, even though we'd never met before. Turns out he does. It was actually it was posted on a Facebook more than any blog I've ever written. It just hit a nerve with the timing, with so many of these former leaders, people like Joshua Harris and other singers just abandoning their faith. And so Justin Brierley, on a show called Unbelievable in the UK, invited us on to have a conversation. And amidst that conversation, we talked about faith and doubt and belief. And then afterwards, we were texting each other, sending each other articles, questions, having just a great conversation off air. Invited him back on my YouTube channel. And we had another conversation on my YouTube channel. And a few things came out of it that were interesting to me. One is he said a number of times, he talked about certainty and how, he's no longer certain. And I stopped him. I said, look, I'm not certain either. If your standard is certainty, there's very few things, if anything, you can know with absolute certainty. I think we should approach this with confidence. So I think if somebody looks at religion and says, I have to be certain about God and the Bible and the resurrection, that's a standard that's just simply too high. Second, I think it found he had questions about inerrancy. And if the Bible's not perfectly inerrant, then it turns out Christianity's false from his view. And I kind of pushed back. I said, look, I believe the Bible is inerrant, and I have reasons for that. But the heart of my faith is the resurrection. And we could actually know that Jesus claimed to be God and resurrected, even if we did have an errant Bible. And my point is not that we do. Again, I don't think the Bible is errant. But let's keep the main thing the main thing. The truth of Christianity rests upon the resurrection. Inerrancy is an in-house doctrine of how we treat Scripture once we understand that Jesus is authoritative and ask what it means to live out the Christian faith. So these are just some of the kind of dynamics that went back and forth. The other one is he had a really experiential faith growing up that I thought was interesting, and he hadn't really been taught to use his mind and think and defend his faith at all until he got older. So I just pressed him on the issues of grace. Like, was there an experience of grace in your life? Because that's when my faith became real. I believed it was true, and my dad gave me apologetics. But it's really when I understood, oh my goodness, I am a sinner. And partly because I think I'm better than all these other people because I haven't done the big sins, I am just as self-righteous, if not more than anybody. That's when my faith really became real. So we just pressed, what are the defining experiences of what it actually means to be a Christian? So I've had a number of people send me notes and say, I started watching the video, I was just going to watch 5 minutes, but I finished the whole thing because it really was it was a respectful dialogue. We're becoming friends. I'd say he's a friend of mine, but there's also substance to it. And I think people are yearning for that kind of interaction today.
Connected to that, And it's interesting how there are two megachurch pastors, I think, out in California who passed away from suicide. And I know that's made news, just like worship leaders actually turn away from the faith, but tremendously tragic. I know Rick Warren out there as well lost a son to suicide. So it's interesting, though, with Rick as well as a few of those other pastors, and actually one of the ones who died by suicide, they've been leading tremendous programs in mental health awareness and really training Christians. This is one we get on a fairly regular basis. When I went for my Master's of Divinity, I tacked on Master's of Mental Health because it's such a serious issue. And I think only pastors typically only get one counseling class in their entire 3 years of divinity training. So a bunch of pastors said to me, just go for it. And I really enjoyed the integration of the two. I've seen in some of your videos, you bring up Carl Jung, I think maybe even a little Jordan Peterson or someone you were discussing with. How do you think through and how have you processed that, and any kind of encouragement or guidance you'd give for Christians and non-Christians when it comes to the mental health issue?
Well, I tread carefully on this because I don't have a master's. I don't consider this my expertise at all. So the only thing that I would add is I think we just need to destigmatize mental health issues. I think there's a lot of segments in the church where somebody feels like if you have to take a certain drug, that's a sign of spiritual weakness. And they don't realize that certain prescribed drugs, actually, as human beings, we are body and we are soul. And even things like depression can be brought on by not eating healthy, not getting enough sleep, by certain physical components. And so to be healthy, I know it requires dealing with our mind and our thinking. That has a lot to do with it, but also many times our body. So I think we need to talk about these issues, not shame people, give them permission to speak. And I think that would at least be the first step. But I do think with this COVID, my guess is, and I'd be curious what you think, maybe this conversation for another time, I think we're going to have an even greater mental health crisis because I've studied Gen Z in depth, and many in Gen Z define themselves as the loneliest generation. I think there's reasons for that. But I think coming out of this COVID, when we eventually do, I think we're going to see even a greater mental health crisis than we've seen before. And the question is, will the church be ready? Will we equip people? Will we take it seriously and speak from the stage in a way that's truthful, but also grace-filled?
I'll just give a couple thoughts here, and then I'll let you turn it over to Sean. I think it's fascinating how depression and suicide, like you said, they were increasing in a staggering kind of way before COVID started. And now you have divorce rates in China skyrocketing. You have the mental health issue. I'm counseling, probably upwards of 10 people right now.
Wow.
Their depression and anxiety, clinically speaking, are much more intense, just exponentially higher. And I'm also counseling a few people who are, have a ton of suicidal ideation, and they're just barely hanging on. So you're exactly right. I think the isolation, the loneliness, opiate epidemic is really growing here. I do a little bit with a foundation on that topic. And I mean, we just had a guy we know who died of, an opioid overdose, and it was all because of the COVID thing. Like, he even said a couple of weeks as we got into COVID, he said, look, I'm going to lose my life because I'm just by myself right now. Wow. And I'm totally isolated, and I know that it's going to take me. Sure enough, he lost his life. So I couldn't agree more. I think the issue is serious. When I was in seminary, it was really disheartening in terms of there's a big Christian group I knew who I was around some people at the time who were going through some pretty bad mental health stuff. And they said, kind of like you were saying, just pray it out. Definitely don't take medication. The nasty one is this is just a sin problem. And then there's a total disconnect supposedly between soul and body. And so some of my most heated debates kind of were on that issue, but such a challenge in terms of thinking that one through. What were some topics you had for him?
Sean, if Jesus Christ rose from the dead, according to the Gospels and according to the apostles, then it's really crucial to find out, did the apostles really die for their claim that they had seen Jesus Christ risen from the dead? Several years ago, I was at Michigan State University, and after speaking, a grad student cornered me in the hallway and did an excellent job pressing me on, Cliff, you said that the apostles who saw Jesus risen from the dead died for it. And I have made the case that and lots of people die for their beliefs, but you can't get a bunch of people to die for what they know to be a lie. So if the apostles claimed that Jesus had risen from the dead without seeing him, knowing that he was dead still, then they died to cover up what they knew to be a lie. And when you study psychology, that's highly unlikely. Sean, I did not do a very good job explaining to that grad student my sources for the apostles dying for what they claimed to have seen, the dead Christ risen from the dead. What would you have said to that grad student?
Well, Cliff, first off, I had a very similar experience that motivated my research into this topic. I was up at Berkeley with a group of high school students, and we had a mythicist who believes Jesus didn't even exist speaking to our students. And one of my students said, well, if Jesus didn't exist, why would all the apostles die for this? Mm-hmm. And he looks at our group, he says, give me evidence that any of them died. Mm-hmm. And I remember thinking, God, I've heard this claim my whole life, but how do we actually know this? This was in, I think, must have been about 2010. At that point, I had started 2011, I had started my PhD work and thought, this is a great topic, assuming nobody has done it. Well, it turned out nobody had. So I started probing, probably 2+ years just of research, tracking down articles from the East on India, articles on Peter, on Paul, on Thomas, you name it. And it turns out that the way I would say it is I published this in an academic book. I don't think we can establish that they all died for their belief. I think we know that the heart of the Christian faith is the resurrection, that he appeared to the 12 and others. They believe this and intentionally put themselves in harm's way because of that belief. Just read Acts 4 and Acts 5. We know some of them died as martyrs, and there's no evidence that any of them recanted. So of the 12, I would say James, the brother of John, and Peter, we have high historical confidence. Andrew and Thomas, I would say at least more plausible than not. The rest of the 12, I'm not sure we know when history ends and when kind of legend begins. But I'd also say Paul and James, the brother of Jesus, we have high confidence they actually died as martyrs. So like you said, this doesn't prove Christianity is true, but it proves the apostles weren't liars. They're not making this up to get themselves harmed. They actually believed Jesus rose from the grave. They went out and they preached this, even though they're threatened and they're thrown in prison. And they ultimately, some of them we know die a martyr's death. So again, this doesn't prove Christianity is true, but minimally it shows they're not liars and they're not inventing something to get themselves tortured and beaten and thrown in prison. There's got to be some other explanation the skeptic is going to come up with than some conspiracy theory that they're lying and inventing these claims.
Thank you, brother. How do you decipher between truth and error when you're reading apocryphal books like the Acts of Peter, Acts of Philip? What literary devices do you use to determine fact from fiction?
Cliff, that's a great question. I don't think there's an easy answer for that, because what these books you're referring to, called the Acts of Peter, Acts of Paul, Acts of John, probably the middle to the end of the 2nd century, then into the 3rd and 4th century, you have these apocryphal accounts that try to fill in the gaps in a fictional kind of way of what happened to the apostles. Well, what we know with Peter, for example, it has him being crucified upside down during the reign of Nero in the Acts of Peter. Well, independently, we can attest some of the facts within the Acts of Peter in early reliable sources, except him being crucified upside down. But him dying as a martyr, going to Rome, we know independently of the Acts of Peter. I think the same is true for the Acts of Paul, and I would argue for the Acts of John. But when it gets to some of these later ones like the Acts of Philip, number one, they're later. And number two, we can't corroborate them externally. So that makes me wonder how much confidence we can have in these historical claims. So I don't think there's a perfect science to know when history ends and when legend begins. I don't. I think it's a question of, take Thomas, for example. The Acts of Thomas is probably written end of the 2nd century to the early 3rd century. Well, there's no independent evidence for this. One thing in its favor is there's no evidence Thomas went anywhere else. There's no other apocryphal stories, which is interesting. All I can find is him going to India. But then you come across this oral tradition in India that overlaps from the St. Thomas Christians with this apocryphal account. So now if they're independent and there's debate about this, there's a question of, wow, do we have two sources that broadly agree that are independent? Now we have at least good reason to think that there's a historical core to this. But it's not easy to always know.
That's a great response. I like your humility in acknowledging there's a lot of unknowns there. All right, moving quickly to the Bible. How do you handle Genesis 1 through 11, pre-Abraham? How do you determine what is history and what is allegory or analogy? How would you handle Job and the book of Jonah?
So I would probably look at Job and Jonah a little differently than I would look at, say, the first chapters in Genesis. I think when you look through the history of interpretation, there's a range of ways that Christians took to questions of the genre of Genesis. Some from being completely literal, physical snake, 6 literal days, to those who take almost all of it metaphorical. I think minimally speaking, there has to be certain historical truths in the book of Genesis, such as Adam and Eve being real historical people within our lineage. And I think this is clear from looking at the lineage alone in the Gospels, like Luke and Matthew. They trace back historically. And of course, Adam is placed in this in the same way that other figures are. Now, I don't think those genealogies were meant to give every single generation, but there's a continuity of historical figures going back to Adam. Second, I think there has to be at least some kind of historical fall for sin to be real and for sin to enter into the human race. So I would just say there's at least minimally a few facts we all have to agree on about Adam being real, being a genuine historical fall, about Satan being real. That's the minimal case. So in Evidence Demands a Verdict, we added a chapter with 10 different ways people have taken Genesis throughout the history of the church. There's different models, but minimally we have to agree that God is a creator, scriptures are reliable, Adam is historical, and there was a genuine real fall would at least be the minimal barrier we would say to have an Orthodox Christian faith.
So you would take in the New Testament, so we were just debating on an atheist channel and had a little bit of a tough time with Adam as a historical figure. I mean, Adam in the Hebrew it means mankind. So it could be numerous. It could be a people group, perhaps. I'm not saying that's my position, but in thinking, we all died once through Adam. This atheist kept saying, well, there's reference back then to Christ. And if you're going to take Christ as a historical figure, there's a reference then back to Adam as well. So it has to be one singular man. And then he obviously went at the science of it, saying that science shows that there's no way we just all descended from one man, one woman. And I know the science, obviously the verdict is out on that. That's not totally true. There's not a consensus on that one. Any further thoughts on that issue?
Yeah, he's 100% wrong about that. And here's why. Look, a friend of mine, Josh Swamidas, recently wrote a book called The Genealogical Adam. And he's a scientist at the University of Washington, St. Louis. And he's a brilliant scientist. And he embraces an evolutionary model. And I don't. But he actually argues, he says, even if evolution is true, it still does not scientifically rule out there being a historical Adam. And the reason is he makes a distinction between most people look at the historical Adam about genetically, but he says, no, biblically, we're supposed to look at Adam genealogically, that he's within our lineage and traces back genealogically. People would not have thought in the day the Bible was written until really 50 years ago in terms of genetics tied to DNA. And he actually shows genealogically. Now, in his model is the assumption that there's people outside of the garden when God creates Adam and Eve. So that's an assumption that raises other questions. I realize that. But he says actually within 6,000 years, and this has nothing to do with people arguing that the earth is 6,000 years old. Within 6,000 years, every single person alive could genealogically trace back to a first couple, and there's zero scientific barriers for this to take place. He has Christians like William Lane Craig. I endorsed it, not that I agree with all of it, but I thought it's a really interesting model. And atheists on the other side saying that the science is sound. So the reason I like that book is not because I hold an evolutionary viewpoint. I don't. I'm not persuaded by it. But for those that do, you can say, look, fine, for sake of conversation, you can have evolution. That still wouldn't rule out a historical Adam. And here's a model that shows this is the case.
That's great. What about Codex Sinaiticus? And I saw a couple minutes of your interview with the man who just came out with that book, Myths and Mistakes. And it was fascinating. He really enjoyed evidence that the man's verdict. He didn't see that there was much overlap. It was funny that you said, oh gosh, now I'm really in the hot seat here with this guy coming out with this book. But how have you thought through, because that's another one we've had with when we've debated atheists. They go to, and obviously grant manuscripts. I like going to Bauckham, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. I love getting after an oral tradition. How do you think through in terms of what came before the manuscripts and obviously after the oral eyewitness testimony? And is there legitimacy to simply saying, okay, we don't have the real originals? And that's what this guy kept going at, but we talked about Codex Sinaiticus a little bit.
First off, I would encourage any of your viewers to watch this interview that I did with Peter Gurry. This book he wrote is powerful. It's called Myths and Mistakes in New Testament Textual Criticism. And he works at Phoenix Seminary, so he's conservative, believes all the things that you and I believe in terms of the core beliefs. And he pushed back on some bad arguments that apologists have made. And I read this book, and in a few places I was like, oh my goodness, I need to tighten up the way I make this argument. I mean, they were merciless in the sense of just going after every bad argument, but gracious in how they did it. And for example, he made the point that we often talk about the earlier manuscripts are better. The earlier we can get, the better. And of course, the earliest we have is a John Rylands papyrus, somewhere between 8100 and 8200. So I had heard that the dating was about 120, 130. He said, we just can't narrow it down that much, which was helpful. He said, but dating doesn't always determine reliability. Sometimes later manuscripts are more reliable than earlier manuscripts, sometimes. And truth isn't determined just by numbers alone. So he's not saying not to make a popular argument, but when it's all said and done, he says, if you just refer to classicists rather than New Testament textual critics, you'll find that classicists consistently recognize that the New Testament is unique in terms of its reliability compared to other works of ancient history. Now, that doesn't mean the other works aren't reliable or trustworthy. We don't have to demonize other works to raise up the Bible. But the point being is if we just use the same standard, that would imply that we should have a lot of confidence in the New Testament. But are there still questions about certain passages? Sure. There's some that we don't know. Of course, the John 7, the ending of Mark, 1 John 5:7, etc. There's some passages that we don't know. So we can push back really close, but we can't push back to that first generation. He said, ultimately, the question is, do we have good reason to believe that this is a group of people that could adequately handle the text and were motivated to accurately handle the text? And everything we know about them is that they were and they are. So I think we just need to be careful the kind of arguments that we've made. I found myself overstating things, and he actually started by reviewing Evidence Demands Verdict. And fortunately, the updated one, he's like, wow, I was reading his book going, oh man, we're going to get buried here. But I was pleasantly surprised that they gave us a lot of praise. They pushed back on one area, which was fine. But for example, give you an example. Oftentimes what happens is we have a manuscript count, and then apologetic books keep copying that manuscript account for 2-3 decades without getting an updated manuscript count. So in evidence, we went and did the work and said, all right, how many do we actually have of these manuscripts? That's one area. Second is sometimes Christians would get the highest manuscript account for the New Testament and the lowest available manuscript account for other books. And he's appealing, saying we've got to be consistent here. Or ironically, we get called on this by atheists and end up not only losing an argument, but losing authority. So it's really an appeal in that book that the truth is on our side. We have the facts. Doesn't mean there's not some questions we have to answer, but let's have some integrity and care how we make these actual arguments.
Well, that's really good. It's definitely original. Did you have one?
I had the privilege a number of years ago to debate Bart Ehrman down at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, before he had published his books. I didn't do a good enough job dealing with him as I look back on it. What do you think is the biggest weakness of Bart Ehrman's position?
Oh, gosh. First off, don't beat yourself up. He is a brilliant, trained debater and knows his audience well. I think he's the most effective and influential atheist/agnostic that's out there. I've had Mormons, I've had Muslims, I've had atheists quote his stuff to me internationally. I think his influence is huge. I mean, when you say his biggest mistake, he writes in so many areas. So I probably need a little bit of specificity for that. But if I had to argue, I think I would say he's very selective in the evidence he points to, and sometimes very inconsistent, and just draws conclusions that don't come from the evidence itself. So if there's questions about the end of Mark and the John 7 passage of the woman that's found in adultery, all that follows is we're not sure about the end of Mark, and we're not sure about that passage in John 7 and 8. Mm-hmm. That's all that follows. None of that has been kept hidden or secret.
Right.
It just hasn't been made. It hasn't been popularized. So I think he draws some conclusions. And look, we're all prone to do this, but I think he draws some conclusions that aren't warranted from the evidence itself because of his biases, because of his worldview, and because of his unique approach. I also think he draws way too much out of contradictions. Even if there are contradictions in the Bible, it doesn't mean Jesus didn't claim to be God. It doesn't mean Jesus didn't rise from the grave. And it wouldn't mean Christianity's not true. And again, I don't think there are, but sometimes I get the impression he's nibbling on secondary issues and drawing conclusions for the whole from it. That's why in debates with people like Mike Licona, we're back to the straw man thing. He held up his hand. He goes, Bart, you're criticizing an issue over here, but I'm making an argument over here. He was trying to visualize it. And again, we're all prone to do that. But I think a lot of people don't pick it up if they don't read his stuff really, really carefully. But give yourself some grace, man. He's a very articulate, thoughtful debater. Good for you for taking him on.
He's also a nice guy. I like him.
He is a nice guy.
What in terms of thinking through, I saw an Unbelievable not too long ago. I think the kid's name is Glenn Shriver. Kind of an up-and-coming apologist, debated Matt Dillahunty, who you debated at Texas State a few years ago. Dillahunty said something interesting. I would love just your brief take. And I know we haven't talked about this before, but your brief take on kind of the four horsemen of the apocalypse when it comes to new atheists. And maybe Dillahunty is like a fifth there, or fourth now that Hitchens has passed. How do you think through, I heard him say on Unbelievable that Shriver pushed him on, do you think that all people have innate value? But he specifically went to every people group. He hinted at kids with Down syndrome in thinking through, are they all worthy of protection or not? And Dillahunty stopped and he said, after 7-8 seconds, I don't know. I don't know if they're all worth protecting. I like that honesty. Do you have any further thinking on that and where new atheists go, especially when it comes to the innate value? I know Peter Singer says that people with Alzheimer's should not be considered humans. So,
I've met Matt once. He was super nice, came to the event I was speaking at, haven't interacted much. I think I watched his one debate with David Wood, but haven't watched a lot of his stuff. I think the new atheist, that movement is done as it is. Its influence is still lingering, I think, on the internet, but times have changed so much. To the point itself, I think that's great that Matt would concede that he's still trying to figure some of those things out. So I think my guess would be, based on the way he described it, is he finds himself in a dilemma. On one hand, he doesn't want to say some human beings have lives not worth living, because that sounds very reminiscent of fascist movements in the past that decide some human beings have value and others don't. He doesn't want to go down that road. But on the flip side, He also realizes that his worldview cannot ground intrinsic human value. So he's caught between the two. And either people take the Peter Singer route and they say, look, actually, you don't have value until, what is it, you're sentient or self-aware a few weeks or months after you're born. I forget exactly where he draws the line, but in some sense, Peter Singer bites the bullet and is consistent. But then everybody points back and goes, whoa, oh my goodness, look at what this implies about other groups. So either you take that group and are consistent, or you try to go the other route and ground human value within an atheistic worldview, which I frankly think is impossible. How does human value burp up through this blind, purposeless, material, evolutionary process? It can't. It doesn't. It makes no sense. So I think he just found himself caught between the two of those and maybe just needs to think it through a little bit more what direction he wants to go. In my experience, most atheists want to affirm that there's a real right and a real wrong. That's my experience. But they'll say certain things and which indicates, like Richard Dawkins will undermine objective moral value. He has that famous quote that says something about right and wrong just happens in this Darwinian world. Some things get hurt. It's just blind, pitiless indifference. But then he turns around and morally condemns Christians for things they do wrong. This kind of inconsistency pops up all the time in almost every atheist I've read or listened to, if you just listen to them enough. And that's because they're made in God's image and they know there's right and wrong and they want to affirm it, but their worldview just doesn't give them space to.
It's a great response. How do you think through, this is the easiest one, right? Love, sexuality, probably the most germane topic to the majority of folks I deal with now. Thinking through the transgender issue, thinking through how that's connected perhaps to gender dysphoria and mental health issues. I was counseling a male turned female a couple of years ago, actually, who, it was interesting, talked about social pressure to become a woman. And I think there's a lot of, it's the whole sociology of knowledge, Peter Berger, in terms of the pressure that we get from the outside and how that forms our identity, even when we don't realize it. And then last night, oddly enough, I was going to ask you on this because it happened last night. So strange. One of our videos on Instagram, one of them talks about, one of us is debating with a guy on polyamory and open marriages. And I'm sure you've seen the latest news story on Will and Jada Pinkett Smith and how she was fooling around with another rapper. This polyamorous, it was polyamorous.usa. And I think they have close to 10,000 followers, so they're pretty big. And they kind of jumped all over our video saying, oh, your ideal in terms of monogamy, how ridiculous and closed-minded. And then there were some Give Me an Answer folks who hopped all over them. And how they defined love was very ambiguous, as well as obviously very open. How do you deal with, in terms of defining love? They said we all define love differently. That was their piece. They didn't go as far as saying love is just neurochemicals and dopamine, but they were headed in that direction. How do you engage with those kind of people?
Well, that's a great question. I think at the heart of it, we're seeing a debate over the difference of love and what love means. So biblically, love is to act for somebody's objective best, whether they recognize it or not. In fact, the people who were putting Jesus to death thought they were doing what was right, but they were actually doing what was wrong. So Christianity, in love, it's that I work for your best emotionally, spiritually, physically, whether you recognize it or admit it or not. And this is kind of a parental kind of love, so to speak. This is not what love means in our culture. Love means I affirm whatever choice you make for yourself. And if I don't affirm and celebrate it, I am bigoted, hateful, and bringing harm to you. So right away, when you enter into this conversation, there's fundamental differences about what love even means. So I think it's fair to press somebody and say, what is love? How do you define love? And give counterexamples that raise the absurdity of the view that they're holding. I think that's one route that I would go. Look, I spend a lot more time asking questions just in general than I do making statements. I want the burden of proof on somebody else, but I also want them to think about certain things. Just like as Greg Koch would say, put a stone in their shoe. But here's a question I don't think there's a good answer to. It's when it came to same-sex marriage, one of the arguments is that a man and man can love each other just as a man and a woman can love each other. Now, on its surface, that's true. But marriage was defined as a man and a woman because of the biological complementarity between a man and between a woman. That's why it was limited to two. So in polyamory, and for those in favor of same-sex marriage, I like to say, okay, once you get rid of biological differences, how do you limit it to two? How do you limit it to three? Why not 10? Why not 20? Why not an entire city gets married? Where do you draw this distinction? Because when we take it out of biology, now it's entirely these feelings that I have. So if it doesn't mean anything in particular, it can actually mean anything in general. So that's a road I like to pick. And I say, once you take biology out of this and complementarity, can it be 3? Can it be 10? What limit and why would you put that limit on it? And it's not a gotcha question. I'm just genuinely interested in how they're going to limit this to 2 or 3, or if they just bite the bullet and say there is no limit. If you love each other, you can all get married. And then marriage just means absolutely nothing.
Do you have follow-up to that?
Not to that now.
That
was good.
That was good. I mean, it's interesting how in the mental health field, when it comes to the transgender topic as well, I think Ravi Zacharias handled this one quite well in his later years in terms of just his grace asking those types of questions. I think he brought up Romans a bunch and how we're all uncomfortable at some level with our brokenness and trying to figure out who we are. From a mental health perspective, I've dealt with a good amount of people who are manic, and they've thought that they were Caesar, Jesus Christ. And just because they think that, does that mean it's real? Does that mean it's true? And to your point, it gets back to the biological basis of it. Now, how about just back to myths and mistakes quickly?
You know what? Can I jump in for a second?
Please do.
Here's where I go with the transgender issue. In fact, I wonder if I have. It might take me too long to find it. I have a book. It's called Transgender Children. Oh, what's the title of this? 2018, Cambridge University Press, and it's entirely written. I could track it down and send you the link. It's entirely written by psychiatrists and professors and medics and parents of transgender kids who are totally on the left. In fact, one of them goes out of his way to say, I'm not like those bigoted, right, hateful Christians. And they all agree. The premise of the book is, look, what does disease mean? It's dis-ease, when you're not at ease with who you are. And they basically say this transgender movement it's like the emperor has no clothes. And they're calling out, not only is it false, scientifically unsupportable, but a massive experiment on this generation that is only pushed because of ideology without real care for how it affects children. Now, if a conservative said that, everyone would say, oh, you're just hateful. We know where you're coming from. But this is a group of left-leaning from the US and the UK pushing back on this narrative. So when you see people like that, and you see the author of the Harry Potter series and other people pushing back who typically are on that side, and their arguments aren't being responded to, but they're being called hateful, it tells me that something else is going on here besides genuine desire to help out this generation and genuine desire for truth. So I could say that, like, I think this is called Transgender Children and Young People. Academic. It's like an $80 book, unfortunately, more expensive than my book on the apostles. But that is, anybody who wants to understand the issues behind transgender needs to unmistakably read this book. Even if you disagree with it, you owe it to yourself to read this perspective.
That's good. I've had a couple people say to me, I have a 1-year-old daughter, it'll be interesting to see the gender that she chooses in a few years. And I thought that was really interesting in thinking through that one and just where minds are going and headed in that direction.
But you know what? Oh, I'm sorry.
No, yeah, go.
Before, I didn't mean to cut out, just before we went to the myths thing.
Yeah.
There is some onus on the church with this.
Yeah.
Because I think we have often taken certain scripts about masculinity and femininity that are not in scripture and forced them upon people. So what happens is you have a girl and she's like, I don't really want to cook. I want to go ride four-wheelers and I want to shoot guns and I want to play outside. Is told, oh, you're not feminine. You have to fit a certain characteristics that we have invented and is not in scripture about feminine, feels disease with herself, relates more with guys, and ends up buying into this transgender narrative. So look at when I ask audiences, I'll say, describe for me a biblical character that you would consider masculine. And people either yell Samson or King David. I'll say, when was King David masculine? Well, when he chopped off Goliath's head. Well, what about when he wrote poetry? What about when he played a harp? The Bible doesn't say he's masculine here and feminine over there. I mean, look at Jesus. He's coming with a sword in Revelation, but he also wept over Jerusalem. So the Bible calls us to act consistently with our biological sex. But I think it gives a lot more leeway of what that looks like than we often give to people. So when we import these stereotypes into the church, I think we actually push forward this transgender narrative indirectly and end up hurting kids. So there's bad news outside of the culture on this narrative, but there's also some things we need to take stock of within the church and do a better job at as well.
Mm-hmm. Just quickly back to, before we go to myths and mistakes. Well, I think it's interesting too, how I talk to people, typically non-Christians, who will say, if your daughter chooses to be male, get her surgery immediately, even if she's only 7 years old. And we get into the whole discussion of whether that's destructive or indestructive, and whether that's going to be destructive later on in life if she wants to change back or not. And so, just like you said, I mean, the scientific side of it, and when it comes to surgery, it is so challenging. It's just tough to see. But that's one we get frequently on college campuses. Another one that kind of caught me off guard this year, it's interesting, I'm sure for you, you probably know this better than we do, how themes change on college campuses, not just generationally, but almost annually. And one that kept coming up other than what is love is this year was eternal life. And I don't know if you're familiar with the David Foster Wallace quote when he talks about, everyone worships something, and if it's something on earth, it's going to eat you alive. I go to that one frequently, and usually college students respond well to that one. How do you help a college student actually desire eternal life? Because I think, back to the mental health piece, depression, anxiety is increasing so much. I'm finding more nihilists now on college campus who are pretty honest in their nihilism. I think they take that approach as well to eternal life. There was a couple people this year who said, I don't want there to be heaven. Nothing about that is tantalizing to me. I went the route of, well, don't you want there to be judgment and fairness and justice to win out? Especially you look at the Me Too movement. We have a serious forgiveness issue in our country right now. So what about the Me Too movement? What about all the terrorism that's going on? I mean, there's so many different ways you could help a person get to. I think you truly do want a judgment day, even though you claim that you don't like the idea of hell. And the mantra for college students now, according to Christian Smith, is Matthew chapter 7. Obviously, do not judge, lest you be judged. I mean, do not judge is the one you're not supposed to do. But thoughts on that?
So if somebody said to me, I don't want to go to heaven, my response would be, tell me what your understanding of heaven is. Because I virtually guarantee you, this person doesn't have a clue what heaven is like, and has imbibed bad ideas from the culture, even probably more likely from the church. And I would say, you know what? I actually don't yearn for that kind of heaven either. If that's actually what heaven was, I'm with you. That sounds boring. Do you mind if I share with you what a biblical view of heaven actually is? Are you interested to hear? Now, if the student says no, then you say, hey, thanks for your honesty. Who do you think is going to win the NBA championship? Whatever, you move on. I mean, if somebody's heart is not open, we can't force their hearts to be open and interested. I mean, Jesus let people walk away from him, like the rich young ruler. But what I try to do is I want to show, if I can, that the deepest yearning this person has is uniquely fulfilled in the Christian worldview. So here's one way to do this. at 9/11, what's interesting is when this tragedy hit, you know what everybody instantly wanted to know? Are my loved ones okay? Nobody said, oh gosh, how much is this building going to cost to replace? Hey, are people getting paid overtime here? Like, nobody asked about that. When Beeman, I forget his first name, called his wife when he said, let's roll, and they were going to take over that plane headed, I think, to the White House. He calls his wife and he just basically says, honey, I love you. When your life is on the line, it's people that matter most. Tragedy reveals to us, it clears away all secondary things and makes us focus on what we care about most. Well, which worldview values people the most? In atheism, humans burped up through this accidental evolutionary process 13.7 billion years into the universe. You're an accident. In pantheism, ironically, there's no difference between persons and non-persons. All is one. Distinctions are artificial. It's actually in the Christian worldview. This is not only do persons matter, but God is tri-personal and is a person in his very being and has made us in his image. So have you ever thought about which worldview values persons the most? Second, we also know it's not just human beings, that it's relationships that matter most. Look at movies like Jurassic Park. It's not really, or Jurassic World, it's not really about a dinosaur getting out of a cage. It's about the relational dynamic during human beings that this drama brings out. And we yearn for reconciliation. We yearn for love. Why? Because we know humans matter most, and we know that we're made for relationship. This COVID has brought out, like you said earlier, that when we're alone, it's sad and it's heartbreaking. And some people have taken their lives because they're so lonely. One thing this tells us is we are made for relationships. The Christian story said God is tripersonal, God is relationship. And we've been made to know God and to know other people. If heaven entailed fulfilling your deepest desire for relationship, to love and to be loved, why wouldn't you want such a thing as heaven? That would be my question. So the way I think about it, think of a beach ball. When you push a beach ball underwater, it naturally pops up because the nature of the beach ball. People who say they don't believe in God still live in God's world, and their worldview forces pushing down the beach ball. I want to show them that actually you really believe certain things because you're made in God's image and you live in God's world. I want to bring to the surface deep yearnings they actually have and show them that they are uniquely fulfilled in the Christian worldview. Because many don't care about our evidence for the scripture or the resurrection or creation if they think God is a moral monster. They don't care about our claims that it's true if they think God is bigotist or if Christians think you should own a slave. What we first have to show is, no, actually God is good. And this fulfills your deepest desires. Then when the heart is open, let me show you why I think it's actually true. And what your heart yearns for, we actually see taking place in history in the person of Jesus. And I use examples of like Infinity War and Endgame with the Avengers. I mean, this whole movie, I won't go into detail, but it's basically about who's the real hero and what is love? What is love? And in the end, it climaxes, and sorry to ruin it for somebody, but you've had plenty of time to see Endgame. It climaxes with Iron Man, the one out of 14 million ways, the only way to save the universe, willingly laying down his life. That sounds really familiar because Jesus says, greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for a friend. That's how I try to reason if somebody's open.
Amen. Wow. Final little one. I would just love to hear your favorite. I mean, maybe it was that one because you just hit it with the intellect, the emotions, everything, which is exactly what I think we want to do as Christians, not just apologists, but every Christian. How do you think through the one? So my favorite argument for an atheist typically is how many people became Christians in the Roman Empire after the resurrection of Christ. And I think you talked about this in a few of your videos and books. Maybe this is your number one argument as well. It's just the resurrection. It all hinges on it. So all the issues we talked about today, it doesn't really matter if the resurrection happened. It doesn't matter if those are false or fallacious in any kind of way. I may have gotten the numbers inflated in terms of how many people became Christian before Constantine in 325. How many roughly in terms of Jewishness as well as Christianity after the resurrection? And so really just the movement of the early church. What would you say numerically speaking? I know Roddy Stark picks up on this some, but what are your thoughts on that?
I don't know the answer to that. I personally have not found it super compelling, the number of people that believe a movement, because Mormonism has grown pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Islam grew pretty quickly. So I think a religion can grow for spiritual reasons. It can grow for sociological reasons. It can grow due to timing. I mean, look, after 9/11, all these people go to church and then they fade away. I mean,
right.
So personally, I haven't found that a super compelling argument that I make. If I just have one argument with somebody, I think you're right that ultimately the resurrection is the basis of, I think, should be our faith. 1 Corinthians 15, 3-5. Paul says, I pass on to you what was passed on to me. What is most important? Jesus died, buried, rose on the third day, and appeared, and he gives a list of appearances. The heart of my faith is the resurrection. But if I had to pick one argument that I think is most compelling, I probably would go with a moral argument, because I think it's inescapable. Everybody wants to be on the right side of history. I mean, just look at COVID, look at the racial issues. Everybody wants to appear to the world as if they are good and they're morally right. Nobody's standing up saying, you know what? Who cares about racism? What's the big deal? Let's move on. Like, if they are, I don't even know who this person is. Everybody is claiming they have the moral right, higher ground. Why? Because we know there's such a thing as justice. We know there's such a thing as right from wrong. We know that we should be good and treat people a certain way. Well, that makes no sense on the atheist worldview, and I don't think you can ground it in pantheism. I think it makes the most sense in the Judeo-Christian worldview. So I like the moral argument because it's not only logical, but it also appeals to the heart and it's existential. Now, that doesn't get us to the cross, but if I'm trying to get somebody to realize this is not just a material world and there's more to reality than what you can touch, taste, feel, and see, I probably would alone use the moral argument, although the cosmological argument is pretty powerful too.
Awesome. Fantastic. Closing thoughts?
Thank you so much, Sean. This was excellent.
Sean, so appreciate you. This great thinking, great answers.
Keep up the great work, brother.
Well, thanks. I love seeing you guys together. This is a lot of fun. You're doing good work, and thanks for the kind invitation to have me on.
For sure. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Again, check out Sean's excellent channel to really equip yourself in a way that's tremendously clear and will help atheists, non-believers think through and hopefully choose to follow Christ in every way. And we'll catch you next week. Take care.